It's a funny place to be, stuck in a seemingly mundane world with an inner knowing that the universe is so much more than our mortal minds can comprehend. Yet we all have the capacity to know peace and our oneness with the wholeness of life. And through these interviews, discussions, and reflections, it is my intention to share this possibility. I'm Ryan Kurczak, and this is the Kriya Yoga Podcast. Okay, welcome everybody back to the Kriya Yoga Podcast. I'm here again with another very special guest and dear friend of mine, Ryan Strong, who is a minister for Center for Spiritual Awareness and a doctor of Ayurveda based out of Sacramento, California. Ryan and I have known each other for a long time, and being a minister of CSA as he is, his Kriya Yoga teacher is also Roy Eugene Davis. So welcome, Ryan. It's good to have you here today.
Thanks for having me on.
And I've talked with Ryan a few times about discussing some interesting things on the podcast, and he had a wonderful idea. Actually, had about 4 wonderful ideas, so we'll see how many we get through in the long run. But the first idea, he began telling me some stories about his initial beliefs about what it meant to be spiritual or to be a Kriya Yogi, and his initial experiences going to Kriya Yoga retreats and meeting Roy Davis and so on. So essentially with this podcast, we're going to be discussing the Kriya Yoga beginner's mind, kind of addressing all of the possible fantasies one might have, or the things that after you've been practicing for a decade or 2 or more, that you tend to let go of and outgrow, and everything that we've learned from once we first got started. So the story that you told, Ryan, had to do with a dietary experience in your life and how that affected you. So if you don't mind, would you go ahead and tell that story to everyone else?
Yeah, when I first found out about Mr. Davis, it was back, it was around 1999, and I was initiated in 2000. And so my first retreat was in 2000. I got to go out and be at the center. And of course I was, when you start off in a good way, we have a lot of passion. We have so much energy towards the path, but sometimes we can put that towards certain ideas that may not be supportive.
Right.
And one of the big things that I thought was spiritual at the time, and I run into this with some of my students, and I'm sure you do too. It's how strongly we can focus in on our diet and how we dress and how we appear to others. And I thought that to be a yogi was to be vegan, right? I just assumed it. I just assumed that's how it was. And so I had already been a vegetarian, so I just went vegan. And I went out there and I met Mr. Davis and was on retreat. And when you go on retreat, private retreats, you spend most of the time by yourself and you meditate in the morning with Mr. Davis. And back then you would meditate in the afternoon with him as well. And once a week, they would make you food. On Wednesdays, they would make you a lunch. And you'd come down, meditate for a few minutes, and then you'd go into the cafeteria or the food hall, and he would announce it. So that first week, he announced that he was going to be cooking lasagna for everyone. And I didn't know anyone. First time I'd gone out there, I didn't have a cell phone, I didn't have a car. And when he announced that he was going to make lasagna, I thought it was a spiritual test.
Just for you, right?
Yeah, well, that's exactly what I thought. And and should I eat it? Should I eat it? It has cheese in it. The pasta has eggs. It's made with eggs and these kind of things. And I just thought about it way too much. I would go back to my room and just kind of contemplate: is this it? Should I eat it? Should I not eat it? And after a couple of days,
I'm trying to imagine you going through this,
right.
existential crisis over lasagna.
Oh yeah, I was having more of those crises than just this at that time, but one that was eating up a lot of my mind. And so I decided, I said, well, I'll do it. If the master makes it, I'm going to have it. That was the right idea. And I felt good about it. And so I went down there, meditated, and I was walking into the hall, and walking in from the meditation hall into the cafeteria. Roy was moving into the cafeteria as well. And it was one of the first things he ever said to me on retreat. He looked at me and he said, "Next time I'll make you roast beef." Yeah. And just a little wink, just a little and I didn't tell anyone. I wasn't talking about this. I didn't know anyone.
Right.
It was supposed to be, silent. So I was holding all these thoughts in, and yeah. So I'll never forget that. It was like he read my mind. He just knew what I was going through, and he was making light of it.
So in a way, it might have been some kind of test.
Yeah, maybe. It's hard to know.
Right.
Hard to know. No, it's just funny how we can get stuck on these things.
Oh, I remember, you talk about him reading your mind, and I can remember many times, going to visit him in the chalet and thinking, I've got to clear my mind. I have to be completely clear, because if I think anything, Roy will be able to, take that opening and know everything about all the weird little thoughts I have in my head. Did you ever have that?
Oh yeah. Tell your mind not to think dirty thoughts and
right.
bad thoughts. All of a sudden they just rush in,
Right.
Yeah. But you learn to just relax around them, and that it was all good.
Yeah. One of the things I experienced too, I talked about this before, so some people have heard this, that kind of sense of, is he reading your mind, or because you read autobiography of a yogi and you read about these great saints and masters, and everyone perpetuates the mythology about them. And so you just assume that that's the case. And I remember I was always sort of intimidated by him, Mr. Davis, for that reason. And one day I was walking from the meditation hall up to the men's little cabin place.
The top house.
Yeah, and he had just pulled in to his chalet, and I just happened to be walking by, and I thought, I'm just going to bring it up. And so I said, you really scare me sometimes. And I was being sincere, because I was like 20, 21 at the time. And he just looked at me, and he threw out his hands really fast and went, boo. And then he just walked away. And that was it. And then for some reason after that, I wasn't concerned anymore. I just had a sense of, all right, well, I guess that's the way it's going to be. So
really, that's what it was. After that moment, you felt relaxed around him.
Yeah. It just felt like we were just hanging out together. And but you had mentioned that there were other things that were going through your mind and troubling you existentially. Hopefully that's the right word for the situation.
That first retreat, absolutely. And one of the things, of course, I thought I was very special. It took me a while to learn that I didn't matter.
Right.
Really. And when I went out there, I just expected him, kind of like in the autobiography when Paramahansa Yogananda sees Sri Yukteswarji the first time, and he embraces him like, I've been waiting for you. You were my disciple, and this is this kind of energy. And my love for Kriya and my feeling for Roy, I felt like that was going to happen. Mm-hmm. And I'd met him before, but when I went out there, he didn't. One of the first things he said in the very first so we'd meditate and then he would talk, and one of the first things he said was, I see all of these people walking around. He said, I see all of these young people walking around. Mm-hmm. And as you know, there wasn't very many young people going
right.
on the streets back then. There was 2, and I was one of them. And I was wearing white, and I had my chest puffed up, and I just was very spiritual.
Right.
He goes, I see all these young people walking around. They feel like they know everything. He goes, but they know nothing. It's something like that. And
wow.
I was like, I just thought, oh, this guy doesn't like me. And so I would try to make eye contact. I wanted some sort of attention
right.
From him. And after a couple of weeks of not getting any attention except for like, just a little bit of, he said that one thing about making me roast beef. I felt like he didn't like me.
Mm-hmm.
It was a big part of me going out there at that time was to be recognized, and it was for my own ego. And I didn't realize that. And to be, up there and it's quiet, there's no cell phones, there's no radio, there was no distractions. And that was really hard for the first time. I'd never been cut off from the world like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I felt like I wanted to leave. I was, this guy doesn't like me. This isn't my guru. This isn't the right path. I just had all of this doubt, all this stuff in my mind. And I remember one day I thought, well, I can't leave because I don't have a car, and my plane it doesn't come for another week and a half or whatever. And so I'm just going to make the best of this. And then I had that thought, it came here for me. And this spiritual path is for me to walk. And I'm looking for all this reassurance from him. And so I said, I'm not going to do that anymore. I let that go. And it was really like the next day. I mean, literally the next day, that's when I began my relationship with him. He came up to me, put his hand on my shoulder, asked me, where are you from? And, these kind of things. And so feeling like when we start off, there's all this energy towards the path, but at least for me, and I'm sure it's true for some others, it's that we want to be recognized for being spiritual. And when we find a teacher, we want them to recognize that within us. But that really is from a place of the ahamkara, or the ego itself. And that was, that's part of that beginner's mind. And I see that with some students. I'm sure you do too. Mm-hmm. Where they want to like please you, or they want to impress you, or
they want to be your friend.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's part of the issue. Like I'm glad you brought all of this up, because it's a very important thing to cover. I had a very similar experience, with Mr. Davis, after reading Autobiography of a Yogi and all these sorts of things. The only slight difference was I was trying to be all professional. And so when I first met him, I just like stuck out my hand to shake his hand. And like, he was the first person who ever really gave me a hug. So I was like, oh, that's interesting. Because, I hadn't gone to massage school yet. So I wasn't all lovey-dovey like, everyone teaches you to be in those situations. But after that, it was this very kind of, it was a relationship of knowledge. And like you, I never had, like, there was never any like specific recognition in any particular way. And I was able to get through that because, well, I wanted to learn what was being taught there. And I heard so many people like talk about Mr. Davis as though he was cold or aloof. Mm-hmm. And I never had that experience. And maybe it's just my own type of personality. But, I can remember even 10 years after meeting him, it was right around the time we moved to Asheville, and I had discovered at the farmer's market that there was an older couple that sold quail eggs. And I was all about quail eggs. I thought this is a wonderful thing, so I'm going to bring some to Roy, as a gift. Mm. And by this time, we had a relationship. I met with him at the chalet. We talked. And, I had been ordained in these sorts of things. And I was so proud. I brought these quail eggs to him. He just looked at me and he said, "I don't want them." And I immediately started like launch into the health benefits of quail eggs, and he just walked away. But you see, that's the wonderful thing is that like, because of there was an understanding of what the relationship was really about, and it wasn't about kind of this idea of kind of pleasing the personality. Yeah. You know what I mean?
I do.
And like you said, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this, but when it comes to students wanting to learn, there are many students that I interact with through the Kriya Yoga apprenticeship program and, other online sources and sometimes in person that they understand that this is for learning. This is for going beyond, our little limited personality. And the relationship then progresses wonderfully because the understanding is we're developing knowledge or devotion or deeper realization. But then every now and then these students show up that it's like they don't really want what you have to share or pass on in regards to helpful knowledge. What they want is to kind of like chat with you or to be your friend or to get some kind of special recognition. So I'm just curious how you have handled things like that.
Well, I think it's case by case, and you mentioned Roy being aloof, and sometimes that's kind of the energy that you have to give someone, and it's not to hurt them or to harm them or to do anything like that, but it's just we have to do this work on our own.
Exactly.
Right. And the relationship with the teacher it can be a crutch.
Mm-hmm.
If we are constantly looking for self-assurance from them, we have to find that within ourselves.
Right.
And so it's a tough one, because I love people and I'm extremely friendly, but sometimes you have to have really good boundaries sometimes.
Right.
Yeah, and allow people to feel uncomfortable. And that's something I learned in Ayurveda as well. It's to allow people to stew it in their own, because you can say something to make someone feel better almost immediately when you sense that they're having a hard time. But if you know that they can find that strength within themselves, you have to sometimes just let them find it.
Right.
And, having that space and being able to feel uncomfortable. Let people feel uncomfortable sometimes.
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah. The idea that I always got with Roy, I never had a sense of aloofness from him, or I was never too terribly uncomfortable around him in that initial fear, mainly because my own dad was pretty quiet and didn't really, there wasn't a whole lot of recognition for anything. So I just thought that's how, elder figures were. But the thing that was very clear about him is that what he was interested in, at least from my experience, and I think probably yours and others, what he was interested in wasn't necessarily your personal life. It was in the work you're doing and the realization.
Absolutely.
It wasn't, there was never do I ever recall him digging into any kind of serious personal matters unless it was something like, well, do you have enough work? Are you able to pay your bills? Things like that. Or do you get along with your family? But when it came to sensitive issues, I always thought that when you have a guru or a teacher, that they're really supposed to get in there and help you figure this stuff out.
Right.
And so whenever I would have an issue, whether it would be a relationship issue or even just a personal, growing pain issue, and I would bring it up to him, he would kind of listen to it for about a minute, and then he would move on to a new topic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I in the beginning, I found that to be I was like, well, what's this all about? Isn't he supposed to be helpful? And it really bothered me for a while. But then after a year or two of that, I began to recognize why he was doing that. And it was because I don't mean to put words in his mouth, but it seemed to me that he understood his role was to help us understand the path and help us understand how to have our own realization. But as far as how do we work out relationship issues, how do we be successful with our time and our money, that that's just part of learning to be a normal person in this world. That's not necessarily a spiritual issue.
Yeah.
I mean, it is in a way. And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree 100%. Having a teacher that doesn't work through, it doesn't fix your problems for
Right.
you. It gives you the clear instructions on, how to work your path, and then says, here's some ideas, here's the way to do it, but also you have to experiment with the process and see how it works for you. Right. But I remember one time, and I did this several times, sending him emails or talking to him about, well, what should I do as far as a career? And one time he sent me an email. He said, I'm not a career counselor.
Wow. That's great.
Yeah. I'm like, okay. All right.
So what would you do then?
Well, I floundered for a while, but eventually I went into Ayurveda, and, looking back at it, I can see that he was very supportive of that, but he wasn't going to tell me to do or not do something.
Right.
We'd give the general advice. I remember he said once, get married and get a job and settle down,
Mm-hmm.
so you can focus on this work. And so it was like general advice, but nothing so specific.
Right. And, a lot of things, I guess, common sense isn't that common as they say, but sometimes I interact with students and they just want to be a free spirit. And they don't understand why every now and then I say, well, do you have steady income? And how are you doing that? Because that was one thing, that Roy always did bring up while there weren't specifics. Like you said, he was very interested in an individual being able to be settled. And as the value in that is what? That if you're settled, then you have time to actually go into deep contemplation. If you have moderate stability, you have less worries pulling you away from the ability to practice the Kriya techniques or contemplation or practicing the yamas and niyamas and the Yoga Sutras. So I'm curious your thoughts on this, because I've always had this idea that yoga and meditation, as far as, say, maybe the Kriya path goes, isn't really for healing or for making things perfect in your world, but that it's almost as if we need to do that first for ourselves, figure those things out for ourselves, such that then we are really freed up to dig into the work that is spiritually clarifying practices. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I would agree. And it's to be stable. And I think the biggest obstacle, and this was for myself, and still can be if I allow it to be, but I can see it to be for a lot of folks. And it's when it's that suffering that comes up, and we all have it in different places. And it's how our world can affect our emotions. And it can be really hard to be dealing with these ups and downs, and to be dealing with our emotional struggles, and to practice. And so if we have regularity, if we have money that supports us enough, if we're not in that survival mode physically, that gives us the ability to also balance our emotional states. And that's different for everyone. Some people, and these things come and go. But the more stable we are, the easier it is for us to have the equanimity or that balance, I should say. So I think that's the real benefit of it.
Right.
And then, of course, that's the path for some people is, to let go of all of that stuff and to be free from all of it. And so, I guess there's not one way, but that's kind of how I see it.
Right. Well, the idea of being free from it, that's a very interesting point, because if you read like into the Gita, and then even certain commentaries I've read from Lahiri Mahasaya, there's this, and he was a householder. He had a job, he had children, he had a family. The idea of letting go of it, there's this deeper sort of body of understanding that the letting go of it isn't getting rid of it. The letting go of it is interacting with life, the world, your family, your job, while being inwardly centered and not defining oneself by it. It's like that renunciation isn't getting rid of things. It's not defining oneself by what is happening. But
I like that.
But if you can steady income and hopefully good health and these sorts of things, that tends to make it a little bit easier, because then you've got time freed up for your meditation and study that you might otherwise be directing towards trying to generate income or trying to get healthier.
Right. And just being in that, I like that. Just
right.
Without that, you're just kind of in survival mode.
Mm-hmm.
That can be hard.
Right.
But, yeah.
And with that, that leads to another kind of idea. And I'm just curious, since this is about the beginner's mind, and I can remember my beginner's mind when it comes to that, by practicing things like yoga and meditation, and I forgot to mention this in the beginning, but Ryan Strong is also a very proficient Vedic astrologer. And in astrology, it's also, there's an idea that if you just live in harmony with your chart, like if you get it perfect, or if you do your meditation perfect, where you find the right guru and so on, that then everything will then just fall into place. You will then just end up having everything that you need. You will then end up being as perfectly healthy as you need to be. I have my own stories, but I'm curious if you had any beginner's mind syndrome about those kinds of things.
Yeah, well, yes, and so strongly looking at everything as good, like this is good and this is bad, and then needing things to be good so that I could be spiritual, and then if things weren't ideal, then I couldn't, then it wasn't spiritual. And so this duality really plagued me, and I think it can plague others. And, it's like having the ideal circumstances in your home. Like I talk to some people and I can't meditate because the vastu in my house isn't right.
Right.
And it's like, no, you have to just do it. Everything is God. Everything is everyone, everything. And, being up on top of a mountain meditating is the same as meditating, in a bathroom at a Circle K on the side of the freeway. Now, avoid meditating in bathrooms if you can.
Right.
But it's essentially the same, and of course there's the gunas and these kind of things to consider, but to constantly look at like, this is good, that's bad. Because then, especially in the beginning, we can put unrealistic expectations on circumstances.
Exactly.
Or like our teachers, to not even see them as just, we could put them on such a pedestal, and then if they show any humanness or any faults, then that can be crushing,
Yes. And that's, so many good points you brought up there, but that idea of the humanness, the first 10 years of my introduction to CSA and Kriya Yoga, I thought I had to essentially live and breathe and act exactly like Roy did.
Yeah.
I was an individual who pretty much throughout my whole teenage years, I had long hair and I listened to rock and roll music, and I was not like Roy at all. I was not a farm boy. I did not have any I did not have any desire to have short hair. I did not have any desire to wear a suit and a tie. Like none of that was of any interest to me at all. But he was raised from a different time. He had a different kind of upbringing, and those things were very important to him. And I could never understand that. I could never understand that constant sense of you must look a certain way. However, because I wanted to be right and appropriate, I thought, well, then I'm just going to do that. I'm just going to adopt that. And, it took a while for me to recognize that that's not, as far as my own expression in this world, that wasn't quite right. And when Roy and I, we got into it, when I say we got into it, I mean, there was a couple like statements of, hey, why don't you do this? And I was like, why are you being judging my physical appearance? Because that's not appropriate, right? That was the end of it. But but when I saw that, I thought, why can't he see through the appearance? And then I had to admit to myself, whether or not any of us have deep levels of realization, we still have our personality tendencies.
Yeah.
And, when you're born in 1931 and raised in Ohio, and when you've been teaching meditation from, the 50s to the 60s to the 70s, there's a whole different kind of sense as to how it's done versus if you were born in a time when, for the most part, meditation is pretty much well known and accepted. And there's no need to prove that it is a thing that not only hippies do.
Right.
But to bring back to the point, that was one of the things that I personally had to confront, was this idea that, there was no need for me to be a replica of Mr. Davis. And even though there was a little point in time where we had a pinch in our relationship because of that, oddly enough, about a year and a half after that, after it had been resolved, I walked in one day and I had just gotten a tattoo on my left forearm, and he still didn't like tattoos, but I thought, do I hide it or not? It's like, nope, I'm just going to walk in and be as I am. And he looked at me, and he looked at my hair, and he looked at my tattoo, and what came out of his mouth was, "Well, I'm glad you finally grew up spiritually." And I thought to myself, all of this struggle, all of this tension, and like you in the beginning, was this a test?
How did you get to that? Because can you talk about, like, how did you get to that place of just getting over that?
Well, yeah, I'm happy to talk about it because I think it's kind of important too. As soon as I learned about meditation, I knew deep down inside, somewhere in my dumb 19-year-old brain, I knew that was important for me to make a part of my life path, not just for me, but to share it as well.
Yeah.
I just knew that somehow. Of course, I had my weird ideas in the beginning, but I knew that. And so when I had first met Roy, the very first time I sat down with him, it was by the pond at CSA on one of those benches. It was after the first initiation, and I said, "Hey, can we meet?" Because I thought maybe I should do that before I drive home 8 hours and don't see you again for another year. And he said, "Sure." And for some odd reason, the first thing that came out of my mouth as soon as we sat down was, "So when can I learn to teach this stuff?" and he just looked at me and made a funny face and patted me on the back, and he said, "Just give it about 5 years." And then he dropped it. And from that point forward, I had a sense that I needed to do this. And Melissa, every now and then when we would go to CSA, when no one else was there, she would kind of catch me in the meditation hall, like sitting in his chair meditating. She'd tell me to get down. But anyway, so because of that, I had the sense, well, if I'm going to do it, I can't do it like I am. Like I can't do it like based on how Ryan's personality is. That I have to follow Roy's example to the T to do it right, to be perfect about it. And so within this 10-year period, I was set on I must start a meditation center. Like there was that sense of that. And that's why I taught classes, and I kept in my mind working towards that this whole time. And Roy knew that. And then when we finally moved to Asheville, Roy decided that might be a good place to do a center. And so he came up and he did a few seminars to generate interest. And then we found a place, and Roy said, "Let's do it." And so CSA took care of everything with that center. And it was all set up and ready to go. And I was like, great, I'm ready to go. I had my suit and my tie, and I was ready to get up there and share the good news and meditate with people.
The good news.
Yeah. And after a while, I started to recognize, wait a minute, I'm doing this in Asheville, North Carolina. And I'm doing it the way Roy wants it done, which is, again, suit and tie, very to the point, get things done, which I personally appreciate. I personally understand that. But when I think about, generating enough donations to get people in the door so that we can keep this thing viable, I keep thinking, we need to do a kirtan. We need to do some things that speak to people in this community. And they were a little more new age types of people, very different than Roy's approach. And we had this kind of constant back and forth about it. And it became crushingly stressful to me. I mean, I've only had one other time in my life where I felt worse, and that was 10 times worse. But this was one of the worst times in my life. And I just couldn't take it anymore. And so I said, look, I wanted to do this for 10 years, and I'm recognizing that I can't do it this way. I can't continue with integrity and make this happen. So we had a little bit of a break during that time. And I had to work that out. So it took me about a year to kind of work through a lot of stuff. And that's when I decided I'm not going to do this in a suit and tie. I'm not going to try to model my behavior after Roy's. I'm going to practice what Roy teaches. And to this day, that is still my main focus. Yeah. I do my best not to stray in any way from what I learned from him, because it has been profoundly transformational. So the core practices I personally don't feel any difference in what he shared and what he taught and what I do. But as far as my presentation style, it's different.
Because you had to be authentic.
Exactly. I couldn't do it in a way, I couldn't mimic Roy. And after about a year and a half, I finally wrote to him. We'd met a few times. And I said, look, this really hurt because I felt like I was being rejected. Like I felt like I was trying to be authentic and have integrity, and that I personally was being, cast aside because I couldn't handle it anymore. But he wrote back and said, I'm sorry, I didn't know that, this was hurtful, or you took it as hurtful. And he just explained, which if I had had any sense at all, I would have seen it. He just explained, with Center for Spiritual Awareness, there's a particular way I like to have things presented as that organization. And, you don't present that way. So that's why we have to do it the way we do now. And there were even times later on where I thought, you know what, I can go back and I can do what he needs me to do. And he said, no, Ryan, he says, your work and your ministry is successful. So you need to just keep doing what you're doing as an independent teacher, but recognizing that, you're my student, I'm your teacher, and we're all in this together. It's still like the family. It's just that you are doing what you need to do, and that is reaching people in a different way. So it was I went through a lot of stress about that, because in a way it was almost like, when I was a kid, I didn't have a very close relationship with my father. I have a closer relationship now, but Roy kind of played that role for me. He was like a father figure to me. So to have someone that I looked at as being I honored and appreciated them so much, to have a sense, which I created in my own mind, of being rejected. It wasn't even real. That was extremely painful for me. But I think maybe that's why, at the end of it all, when I came in and I was just comfortable being whatever expression Ryan was supposed to be, that's when he said, well, I'm glad you finally grew up. Because I think he was, in my mind, I imagine he was acknowledging, okay, now you can be authentic and we can move on. We can continue doing what we need to do in our own interpersonal relationship.
Do you feel like when you let that go, when you let go of trying to be a certain way and then being more authentic, do you feel like that really helped your practice?
Oh, absolutely. It not only helped my practice. I mean, I wish I could describe the difference, but my practice was good. But once I let that go and I was able to simply, accept whatever it is I needed to accept, my meditations became deeper and longer and clearer. And then I also found that whereas for 10 years I was trying to, generate people's interest in meditation, like I really wanted to go out and save the souls, and introduce them to the power of Kriya Yoga. It was after this particular transition in this rough patch that I just said, you know what? I'm not going to take it I'm not going to take it so severely, and I'm going to present what I know to be true and authentic and what works, and I'm not going to go into any kind of fantasy. And I just started offering it through YouTube, through local classes and things, and no advertising, no real push to do anything at all. And it was at that time that all of a sudden classes began to grow, interest began to grow. I found that not only did it help myself internally be able to walk the path with greater clarity, but it also allowed me to reach, for some reason, I don't know why, but it allowed me to reach more people, and more people were actually more responsive to the work. So because your creativity was able to flow? I don't know if it was the creativity. I think for me, it really boiled down to a sense of just kind of honesty. And that's not even really the right word. Like, for example, when you're at CSA, there is an emphasis towards, when you meditate, there's a sense of, honoring the guru lineage and the guru tradition. Mm-hmm. And that is perfectly fine, and I still do that myself. So internally, I'm actually still really a CSA member. But I had a hard time doing that, and I wanted to let people know you need to honor that same light that you see within, say, Yogananda or Lahiri Mahasaya or Sri Yukteswar, that same light that is within you. Mm-hmm. And so when I would begin leading meditation seminars, I would tell people, of course, to choose to honor those individuals that they learned from. But I would encourage them to really honor that light within them, which is the same light within everyone. And now that was just my own personal way of kind of connecting. And once I started doing that, I felt more comfortable. Like I felt more at ease inside. I didn't feel like I was trying to share something or teach something that I didn't quite jive with. Like, for example, I love Autobiography of a Yogi. I think it is a wonderful book. However, I personally question a lot of the fantastic stories in there.
Right.
And so at a point in time, I specifically said, look, you don't read that book to be wowed. You read that book to kind of get to the moral of the stories that Yogananda is teaching. Yeah. And that became, a lot of people didn't like that because they wanted to mythologize and like really exaggerate the potential and possibility of the spiritual practice. But I couldn't do that. And then again, once I started approaching it from that direction, people started coming to classes and workshops saying, you know what, I always loved Kriya Yoga. I always loved the idea of it, but I always felt like I had to buy into this fantastic approach to it to be accepted. And since you're not doing that, I feel like I can actually practice now. So it's almost like it gave people another avenue to walk the path and connect in a way that felt more authentic to them. Authentic
and also grounded.
Grounded, yeah. So that in my mind is kind of what happened from all of that. And I hope people don't take this in any way. I have the utmost respect for all of the Kriya Yoga lineage, but to be very honest, I see them as human beings too. Like they are people. They had a body, they had a mind, they had a personality, like we all do. And it doesn't mean that if you think that about a teacher that you're disrespecting them, because you're not supposed to see that in them anyway. What you're supposed to see is that guru light, that which is beyond the mind, body, and personality. Like I would love to, I love to encourage people to recognize that, that is within you too. And Roy, I believe Roy I know Roy understood that, but it was a wonderful thing to interact with him during the last few years of his life, because at least in person, like when we were having conversations at the chalet, like they were very much down to earth types of things, as they always were with him. But for example, one time I remember going to meet with him, and I just kept having this realization that what realization really was, or self-realization really was right here and right now. And that everything that we're experiencing is it. Meaning me talking to you, sitting in this chair, having a cup of tea earlier, having an argument with a teenager 2 days ago, things like that. That is all an expression of God. So therefore, this is all it. And I remember going to sit with him, and I looked around, I said, I've got a question. And he just kind of stopped the story he was telling. He looked at me and said, okay, what is it? I looked around and I said, I don't know how to explain it, but my overall sense is that really this is it. Everything that we're experiencing, this is it. And he stopped and he took a sip of his tea and he looked around the room. He said, yep, that's about right. And then he went right back into his story. And one last thing I'll say is, that I found very, very important in regards to my relationship with him. He was very close to Melissa too, my wife who had passed, and you were as well. I mean, we were all pretty close. But when she was sick and we found out that she wasn't going to make it, and even though we thought she was, one of the most helpful things he ever said to me was, I wish I could perform miracles. Because he didn't say, she's going to be better and believe in God and, pray harder and these sorts of things. What he said was, I wish I could perform miracles.
Yeah, he was so sweet in that way.
Yeah, so that's, and that meant a lot to me, because he was admitting, just that life isn't, to me, what came across was life is about more than just getting what we want all the time. And that was really kind of a beautiful thing. And then for me, aside from that earlier, kind of growing pain thing, like that experience itself was also an ignition towards growing, because then I began, whereas I said, Tim, this is all it. And he said, sure it is. I believed that in my mind. But when he had that response, to what was going on with Melissa, for some reason it triggered in me this understanding that suffering, that life and death and illness and health and beauty and wellness and joy and sadness, that is the totality of it all. And if we run around trying to only experience the positive things, or not honor and embrace when something's not going our way, we are creating duality.
Yes.
And so from that point forward, despite the suffering that happened, well, there's been joy since then. And part of the greatest part of my own path has been learning to integrate and reconcile that whether there's joy or whether there's sadness, there's always God.
Yeah. Beautiful. Well said.
So, yeah. Anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. It's left me speechless there, Ryan.
Well, me too. That's not good for a podcast.
That's all right. With Roy, one thing that I always got from him, and especially in the beginning and starting out, and I didn't quite realize it at the time, and it was years later, but it was no matter what he was, because he would sometimes he would give me a hard time about certain things. Mm-hmm. Like one time we were at a conference and I walked by and I saw him, and I kind of stopped and I put my hands together and I did a namaste, kind of bowed to him. And later he, talking to him, he said, I don't want any of these, and he demonstrated what I did. He goes, I don't want any of these monkeys around me. And he's giving me a hard time. He didn't like to be treated that way. Right. But in some of the hard stuff that he would, some of the things, he was helping me grow. And right. Sometimes it'd feel like there was a little friction, or it would feel like maybe there was some disapproval, or leading me to be a different, to change. And it wouldn't feel good, but then but there was always this other part of him that was really unattached, and then just pure love. It was so accepting and so much. It was like he had unconditional love. Right. He could be directing, but he could also have this unattached, unconditional love about him. And I think that is one of the greatest things that I ever got from him, was to have another human being who had that totality that you're talking about, the whole experience, all that stuff. And to just be sort of in it with him, and for him to just kind of recognize that, or he would give you this energy of it's all, it is, and this is okay. And I don't know if that makes any sense, but there was just this love, this unconditional love that I felt from him. Right.
And yeah, I can relate to that. And that's when I think about people wanting to begin on this path, and sort of some of the ideas that they have, we have a lot of ideas about what spirituality is supposed to be like. And, for example, one of the things that I really got into when I was learning Vedic astrology and Ayurveda, I thought, well, I need to learn Sanskrit too, because obviously if I'm going to be a good yogi, we got to know Sanskrit, right? So I began learning it, and I also got really heavily into mantras. I began learning any mantra I could, long mantras, short mantras, and I was so excited about that. And I remember going to visit him during a retreat in the spring one time, and I had my books with me, and I told him about the mantras I was learning and how I was learning Sanskrit and how I'm learning all these wonderful things. And he looked at me and he said, "Oh, you outgrow that eventually." And then he moved on, and I thought to myself, what does he mean? Doesn't he know? Surely Roy, a student of Yogananda's, knows how holy all of this is and what I'm doing is.
Right.
And he just said, you outgrow that eventually. So,
yeah, I was starting to really get, and I still, Sanskrit is really hard for me. Being dyslexic, it's probably something I'll never know very well. And then with my pronunciations, I have to work really hard.
Right.
And I was talking to him a little bit about this privately. And then one of the last meditations that I was with him before he passed, he was giving a talk, and he said, yoga, chitta, vritti, nirodha. And he was giving a speech. And then he said, but after he said the Sanskrit, he said, and that's all the Sanskrit I know. Just and he winked at me, he gives that little wink. And
right.
So kind of similar in that way.
Did you have any, I'm about to tell a really kind of childish thing, but maybe you relate. I don't know. We'll see. One of the things that I always did, especially in the beginning, actually pretty far in, but one of the things I always did is like every time I would meet with Mr. Davis, really, as I'm sure you experienced, it was just kind of having a conversation. You just sit down, and it wasn't like, let's meditate for hours in samadhi together. It was, let's talk about what's going on around the CSA grounds and how your work's doing and what I'm getting ready to publish and these sorts of things.
Yeah.
But if I didn't go to the chalet and meet with him, when he would make tea or chai or whatnot, he would come to one of the guest houses, and I would always make him tea. But he only always drank like half the cup of tea I gave him. So, of course, when he left, I thought to myself, well, I've got to go drink that, because surely there's some super spiritual power in there because of who he is. So I'm just curious, is that only my childish thing, or did you do anything like that?
Oh, constantly. There was a couple of times where he wrote a little note. You'd get, like, one time he was giving me directions to how to find where Yogananda had lived in 29 Palms, and he wrote that little note down, or he gave me some books on cooking and different things. And like every single one of those things, is like in a very special place wrapped in plastic.
Right.
And so, I would do that. And every time I'd meet with them in those extended times down the chalet, I would go and meditate, and I would just, it was just such a special experience. And anything that he would say, I would try to remember and write down. But like you said, a lot of it was just kind of, talking and just very simple conversation.
Right.
It would be hard to remember.
Right.
Because it was just relaxed and just talking. But I would do anything like that. I know what I did. This is maybe even, you said you got to drink out of the cup. I'm like, oh, you're lucky. But when I would go, almost every year where he, because he would come in early in the morning, park, and then go up into his chalet, up into his office. And there's all those little rocks that he would walk on. I would always take one of those rocks, and I have a bunch of them. And it's like the guru walked on this rock, and so I know that is pretty childish in a lot of ways, but it just, it felt special to me.
Yeah. Well, that's I can remember. I believe Roy wrote about it in his book, Paramahansa Yogananda as I Knew Him. So I think he did it too, because if I recall correctly, didn't like Yogananda give him a banana one time, and he thought he didn't want to miss any of the blessings from that, so he ate the peel as well.
Right.
Was that
That's
right?
So true. I remember that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
So I guess what this brings us to then is the question of the idea, since we have admitted the things that we did, and Roy even said when you tried to pranam to him, he said something about, I don't want to be surrounded by these monkeys, right? So he was very clear that he didn't want special treatment in that way, right? And having someone a few times try to like touch my feet for some reason after a meditation seminar, I'm like, look, knock that off. Like, there's no, that's not what we need to do here. So how do we reconcile that to let people know that, hey, this is part of the process, but in the long run, like, we grow out of that, because even with Mr. Davis, the last 5 years before he passed, I really didn't do that anymore. And it was more of just like a normal, natural relationship. And what I found is personally, when that relationship became more like, my 88-year-old elder father figure person, myself, just being together without any of this kind of, pretentious isn't really the word, but that's the best I can think of, without any of that
circumstance.
It actually became like, the relationship became clearer. It became more supportive. So how do we reconcile these little things that we do without, how do we grow out of that while also honoring that? And how do we help other people see that, those things are good for devotion, and that's probably a stage that people go through, but that's not where we want to stay. Any thoughts on that?
I think that it's, it's okay to have that love for the teacher and to really cherish those moments and to have that respect. But I think it's kind of what you were talking about with your story, with how you found your being authentic and how your creativity flowed and how things started to work more for you when you were doing what was right for you. And that growth that someone experiences when they start to see the totality of consciousness, that everything is one thing, that God is everyone, right? Not just the good, everyone and everything. And the more that we can, one, recognize that mentally, but to also start to experience that through meditation and through experiencing what Mr. Davis would say, super conscious states, above ordinary states of consciousness. And the more that you can practice that, and if you can't do it yet, the practice of imagining it, I found that to be really helpful, right? Being able to imagine that you can experience these things can help you actually experience them. But the more you have that mentality with everything you do, the other stuff, the separation, the duality, I feel like that kind of fades away. But at the same time, you still might really cherish that cup sitting there.
Right. Oh, completely.
It's okay to be human. It's okay to.
And not to.
Like I have some of Yogananda's hair, and I really cherish it.
How'd you get that?
A couple of different people gave it to me.
Wow.
It was passed on to them, and yeah.
Yeah, I remember, again, the last time that Roy saw Melissa, he came up to visit her while she was, on her way out. Ron drove Roy up, and we had tea, and we talked.
So he came, that's like a 3-hour drive for him.
Yeah. So he came up and he stayed, and Melissa was just ecstatic about it. But same thing happened. We made tea, and he drank half of it. And this time Melissa said, "This time I get it."
Yeah.
So, but anyway, well, yeah, there's so many things that I think
there's so much.
When we start out, it's just, and even when I look back, one of the things I do now to have that sense of kind of attunement is I kind of just remember like the experiences I had with Mr. Davis, like those moments when I'd first showed up, and as soon as I would leave the chalet, he would like pat me on the head, kind of like that idea of giving a blessing, or like you mentioned, like the little winks he would do, those sorts of things. And so when I'm meditating, sometimes I'll just remember those things, and I'll have a sense that whatever clarity was in those moments, because there was certainly clarity there, that I accept that right now, to make it that it is ever present. That kind of, I think, helps carry us through as we evolve through life. And we have teachers and people in our life that are important to us, and they're going to pass, but that spirit, that energy, that consciousness, well, it becomes a part of us now. As you being a CSA minister, me doing the work that I do, like now that it is our role and our job to share useful meditation information and share what we can to help people understand the Yoga Sutras or come to their own conclusions about it and so on. So I think it's important to recognize that we we are part of like a whole progression.
Mm-hmm.
And that progression is even going to continue, obviously, beyond us and way into the future. And that while things don't necessarily persist through time, that consciousness does persist, throughout all of that. So
Absolutely.
yeah. Well, anyway, I think we're coming to our time, and so I want to read just a quick quote, because as we were talking about this, I was reminded of a passage from a text related to Lahiri Mahasaya, and I think it might relate to what we've been trying to share throughout all of our stories. So this is from maybe the commentary on the Guru Gita. Anyway, Lahiri Mahasaya had written that when the state I am all comes about in the after effects of Kriya, one witnesses the supreme, which is the inexpressible thing, this beyond the beyond, or the higher than the highest. There is nothing other than this. Then one is free from disease, meaning the mind does not go in other directions. And upon witnessing the supreme, one becomes completely liberated from all attachments and connections, and one sees that one Brahman in everyone and everything. It is known as oneness. When all is seen as one, for what can there be any desire? Immediately upon ending of desire, one attains supreme peace. So I thought of that as we were talking about all of this. So.
That's great.
But anyway, I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks for having me.
To do this, and we have at least a few more topics that we can reconvene on.
Okay.
So we'll see how that goes. Those of you who want to find Ryan Strong, he's in Sacramento, California. He's a CSA minister, a doctor of Ayurveda. He's also a very proficient Vedic astrologer. So how could they contact you, Ryan? Do you have a website that you use?
My website is www.stronghealthcenter.org.
Okay, stronghealthcenter.org. And I'll go ahead and I'll put that into the information section below this, the play button. So, all right. Will you be well, Ryan? And I really appreciate you taking the time to be here.
Thank you, sir. Have a good day.
Okay, take care.
This episode of the Kriya Yoga Podcast was made possible by donations from Kriya Yoga apprenticeship students and supporters of our Patreon community at www.patreon.com/Kriya Yoga.